Last player standing. Spike down A.
Gear up, stay safe, we're going back in.
Reloading.
No charges left. No charges left. My ultimate is not ready. Sage's walls are coming down. No charges left. No charges left. No charges left.
Spike planted. Last player standing.
Tango down.
Now I know how annoying my healing can be.
Oh.
Fight! No charges left.
Enemy spotted A.
Healing you.
Reloading.
Spike planted.
Enemy spotted B. Enemy spotted.
Hostile KIA. Target sighted B. Grenade out.
No charges left.
Three kills.
Don't rush me.
Last player standing.
No one beats my firepower. I got this.
You all again.
Who's next?
There. Enemy spotted. Enemy spotted.
No charges left. Get out of my way!
Last player standing. Spike planted.
Obstacle removed.
My power does not ebb. Ask for aid, and you shall receive.
Let's make them dance.
Nowhere to run!
Target sighted A.
Enemy spotted B.
One enemy remaining. Spike down A.
I don't grieve.
Oh, it's personal now.
PLACA.
Ay, corazón. Here comes the party! I blew you up!
Spike planted.
Stuffed out.
One enemy remaining.
No need for this.
Paint? Check. Charges? Check. Brakes? Nowhere in sight.
Spike down A. One enemy remaining.
Flash. No one walks away. I would let you live, but that does not compute.
Let them try to get through me.
I want to see you crawl.
Target sighted A. Multiple targets A. Kill confirmed.
One enemy remaining.
Sighted enemy.
Spike down A. Flawless.
That lot was trash.
If you lose focus, you die. Breathe when it's over.
We can overcome them.
Multiple enemies B.
Get out of my way!
Target attacker spot.
For you. Your duty is not over. So what I mean?
One enemy remaining.
Target sighted B.
Spike down B.
You were big.
They're nothing but flies.
Who's next?
Spike planted.
Multiple enemies B. Don't get in my way.
Target sighted B.
Killed. One down. Enemy spotted B.
One enemy remaining. Last player standing.
Flashbang.
Clutch.
I hear them scurrying.
No prisoners.
Wall raised.
Spike down B.
Spotted B.
Good attempt.
One enemy remaining. Last round in the half.
We cannot keep our goods after this.
Reloading.
Spend all.
Come.
No charges left.
They will cover.
You will not kill my allies!
Poison orb emitting. Poison's off.
Spike planted. Last player standing. Switching sides.
Functions okay? I know humans get tired.
First enemy soldier. The enemy has taken control of the battle. Seize control of the objectives. We have lost objective Bertha, soldiers. Objective Bertha is ours! We have taken objective Caesar! objective Caesar. We have taken objective Emil. Good job. Beware, we have lost objective Anton. Good. Objective Dora is ours now. Ja, wir brauchen einen Luftschlag. Eine V1.
Feuerbus ist uns befehlt. Er kommt.
Attention, we are losing objective Bertha. Opening fire.
Aufpassen! Da ist Gefahr!
Objective Caesar ist ours.
Das Ziel gehört uns! Da bist du ja.
Objective Bertha has been lost.
Wir haben das Ziel an den Feind verloren!
Good work. Objective Anton taken. have lost objective Dora.
near or at 100%. This is what being CPU bottlenecked looks like. Reducing the renderer worker count by 1 reduces CPU load by just enough to keep the graph below 100%. By the way, the more these spikes are trying to reach above 100%, the more micro-stuttering, hitching, and lag you'll experience. Alright, let's look at a benchmark for this. For a value of 3, the GPU usage shows that the GPU is now being utilized considerably more now that the CPU isn't bottlenecked anymore, and the FPS increases rather dramatically. At a count of 2, we overshoot that sweet spot of using the hardware to its peak performance. The best settings for the vast majority of players here will be 1 less than your total amount of CPU cores, as long as you don't have CPU intensive apps in the background, such as if you're streaming, have a collection of Google Chrome windows open, or you're just someone that enjoys having an overall bloated Windows. If you want to verify this is the right choice for your particular CPU or setup, you can just go to Start, Task Manager, Performance, CPU. Now you're going to right click on the graph and select Change Graph to Logical Processors. And now you can monitor the CPU use per core for the last 60 seconds. If CPU use is sitting at 100% on any core, you are losing frames due to it. Just keep turning renderer worker count down by 1 until your first core is not constantly flirting with 100%. Remember, you need to restart the game for a change in this ini file to take effect. While we're here, let's take a look at my higher end 11900K, which is an 8-core 16-thread test bench. You'll notice setting it to 8 keeps the first core at 100%. This is what we want to avoid, as it's costing us some heavy frames. At 6, we're looking really good, with spikes hitting 100% barely. This is actually the ideal
Get yourself
situation
a proper warm-up. We'll be
using our
deployed
hardware
soon.
to its peak performance. As always, there will be a few comments about the activated Windows logo. I have to have this logo for benchmarking purposes, but you don't have to. Since it just so happens I'm friends with
Enemy dropping into the AO.
A website that sells Windows 10 CD keys for $100, and they agree to give subscribers 45% off on it. Literally, you guys can have a copy of Windows 10. Check the video description below for the discount code. I'll also include a
Hostile dropping into the area. Watch the skies.
The final FPS results for bullet impact
Enough
and
practice.
sprays
Time
is
for
going
the
to be
real
less
thing.
than 1%, but that is assuming that your CPU is not bottlenecking and your renderer worker count is stuttering, lower over the top, very recommendation, really don't help with that. And keeping CPU usage down is kind of a big deal in Warzone.
Battle Royale.
Alright, let's move on
Gas
to
is approaching your position. Move to the
Don't be
safe
fooled by
zone.
this picture. In Warzone, you'll have an extremely hard time finding a text rate that actually gets an upgrade from the setting. Trust me, there's over 20 scenes, only 2 will actually have a text rate upgrade, and I generally always go. This is one of the things I pointed out up close. It's still difficult to notice unless you look between the benchmarks and episodes. If you're wondering why they even bother including the it's because isolation can make a big difference in other Call of Duty modes.
Targets are up. Get to
Battle
work.
Royale, they've actually been removing isolation. The result today is that performance impact is negligible and the visual difference is, well, kind of pathetic. So the recommendation here will be disabled because there's nothing to achieve and there is VRAM to be gained. Moving on down, we have on-demand texture streaming. This setting will only have a visual difference if texture resolution is set to high. Those high-resolution textures don't come with the initial game install. These huge textures are what causes the insanely high VRAM use on the texture resolution high setting. If you remember, the graphics didn't improve much unless you were really close, and not to our surprise, it severely gobbled up our precious VRAM. Thus, the recommendation here is to set this one to disabled from the moment you install Warzone, because you'll also save some hard drive space. Under shadow and lighting, the first option is shadow map resolution. Contrary to most online sources that guess how this works, actual FPS goes up the higher the setting. Shadows are very on low with fading edges. But this effect is an added filter. The rendering algorithm for this begins with the high setting, which is why the FPS goes down towards the low setting. You're essentially rendering accurate shadows and then adding special effects to them in order to make their edges softer. Quite frankly, the gas price is more interesting than this shadow softening effect. Sometimes the blur effect is more prominent far away. Other times it's more blurry up close. FPS cost can be up to 5% FPS for disabled. Remember, this setting works backwards. Disabled is actually adding additional effects and hurting our performance. During motion, the FPS performance remains the same as the other benchmarks standing still. Worth noting that during motion, the quality of shadows is rather hard to notice, although it's still there. The final recommendation here will be high instead of extra. The big reason is because VRAM use is particularly high on extra, but also because shadows are unnaturally sharp and distracting on extra as well. Up next, cache spot shadows. This setting will have no graphical difference, since all it does is create a data cache in your VRAM, which it uses to render indoor lights more easily. The result is that it uses more VRAM with the intent to increase FPS. Surprisingly, the FPS difference indoors is almost insignificant, where outdoors the difference becomes about 4%. This is because of the amount of shadows on the screen, even if they are too far or in a window. I know that's surprising, so here it is again in a different season. Keep in mind, I do run far more of these tests than I include in my final YouTube video to verify these results. The VRAM difference here is usually a couple of megabytes, but this isn't much considering it's an up to 5% FPS gain. So set this one to on if you can spare the 200 megabytes of VRAM. Moving on to cache sun shadows, this setting should be the same as the previous, but should apply only to global illumination, also known as the sun. Again, we notice a minor increase in VRAM use. On the ground, we get a similar FPS increase ranging from 2 to 4%. The highest FPS difference I was able to get is going up high, which increases our view range, and we get a 5-6% FPS increase from having this setting. Some games have a bigger impact on motion, but in Warzone I got similar results regardless of speed or even location. Again, we have an FPS increase 2 to 6% at the cost of a couple of hundred megabytes in VRAM. So set this one to enabled. Jumping down, particle lighting. No joke, everything I've read about this setting online.
Survive and you can redeploy.
Do picture over here. I decided the best way to show this would be to find the exact location and recreate this exact scene. And did find the location over here. Unfortunately, this location is in Razna Raid of Modern Warfare, which is basically a different game altogether with its own settings. So let's recreate this explosion anyway in Warzone.
There's a fight kicking off.
In case you missed it,
Get yourself sorted. You're up next.
There is no FPS difference.
Listen up, soldier. Win here and you return to the front line. If you lose, you're done. You're up, soldier. Now go, looking a little worse for wear.
The recommended will be disabled because
hit us hard that time and we'll settle the score.
Next is ray tracing. There's a reason the example picture here is also not taken in Warzone. That's because you cannot take it in Warzone, since there's no ray tracing in Warzone. The setting is likely here just to promote ray tracing supported games, without actually supporting ray tracing. The ray tracing setting doesn't even override screen space reflections, like it does in any other game. But let's be detailed and look at a few benchmarks anyway. To be fair, ray tracing is actually supported in other Call of Duty modes and the campaign, and it does look really good, but I won't show that in this video to avoid any confusion. So, although Call of Duty has ray tracing, having added the setting to the Warzone menu is just misleading. Recommendation will be disabled because setting it to enabled would just trigger my OCD. Hopping one down, we have ambient occlusion, which is a shadow technique used to add soft shadows to make the game look more realistic. I want to first point something out. This setting does not add any major shadows to the game, the kind that have clearly defined edges. The reason you may have seen this claim before is because this particular setting you can't just change. You also need to move around a little bit until the settings effects are properly loaded and take effect. Now, what the setting actually does is determine how exposed certain textures are to diffused, non-directional ambient lighting. Notice how the ambient shadows introduced here do not have sharp, clearly defined edges. Think of it as secondary shadows created by darkening parts of a texture, rather than adding light to the surrounding areas the way shadows are traditionally created. Outdoors has the highest impact to our FPS, which ranges from 1% to a 5% FPS drop depending on the location. Unfortunately, outdoors is also where ambient occlusion is the least noticeable. For the most part, it just makes the grass texture slightly darker. Indoors, the performance impact is generally very small, but indoors is also where ambient lighting is more noticeable. Obviously, the ceiling light fixture here stands out, but there's also other subtle changes that become apparent when we flick back and forth between the benches. Dynamic doesn't actually mean moving objects, such as cars, ATVs. They actually still fall under static objects. As a matter of fact, after testing everything I could find that has motion, I was unable to find anything that has an effect from the dynamic setting. And given that other online sources also couldn't find one either, it's safe to say there's likely no dynamic objects that work with ambient occlusion in Warzone. Even the weapon skins are considered static for this setting. So, with that in mind, we recommend disabled because, well, losing frames for some darker shadows is not worth it. Next up, screen space reflections. This adds reflections to surfaces without the use of true ray tracing. Unfortunately, unlike ray tracing, this setting will also introduce a lot of visual noise. The amount will depend on what is being reflected. On disabled, there is no reflections. On low, we get a reflection of the background trees and tower. The car also gains a reflection on normal and high, but the visual noise also becomes distractingly abundant. This is not a glitch, it's just a flaw of screen space reflections technology, and happens in other games too. In Cyberpunk, for example, it was particularly bad. I have a setting benchmark video on that game as well. Essentially, this happens because there isn't enough rays being traced, so the missing pixels information is filled using data from previous frames in which the pixel info was obscured, such as by the motion of the pistol will produce this noise around the pistol. This noise doesn't always happen. It generally only happens when reflecting shadows or certain lighting effects. Regardless, the performance difference from disabled to low is almost insignificant. Normal and high carry a hefty 5% FPS decrease, but is also where enemies have a reflection. Personally, I think it's very unlikely you'd notice an enemy's reflection before you actually see him. The recommendation for this one is gonna be off, since it's a competitive game and performance is much more important. Next up, anti-aliasing is a bit of a controversial setting for some. The role of anti-aliasing is to increase geometry of objects, which in turn makes them smoother. However, some games like Warzone and Monster Hunter World also employ a cheap trick that just blurs the image as a way to hide the poor polygon count. Having it disabled has edges looking very jagged and flickering. This makes it harder to notice subtle movements in the background and is quite distracting to the eyes. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Filmic T2X. It completely removes the flickering edges and softens the image.